Welcome to Chapter 4 for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this chapter, we'll be examining how we form perceptions of other people that help us understand how to behave in relation to them, help us to predict what they're most likely to be feeling or most likely to be doing. In this video, we'll be covering the first learning objective for this chapter. Social perception refers to this process of forming understandings and making judgments about who other people are, what they're like, what they prefer, and how they're most likely to behave, specifically in their interactions with us, but also in the broader context. Essentially, the first thing you need to accept is that despite the fact that we feel pretty confident that we can do this social perception thing really well, people are actually not that easy to figure out because they have personality attributes, they have their whole past experiences, but they're also embedded in situations that are very powerful. So part of our job in doing person perception is to figure out which matters more. How do we decode, even in tiny little interactions, what people's personalities are, what their situation is, and so on. As a species, we've evolved this capacity for a reason, this capacity for social perception for a reason, and that's because we depend on living with and understanding other people in order to survive and thrive, in order to reproduce, in order to just get along. We are social creatures. We tend to live in groups, and we rely on other people for a great deal of the things that we need. That leads us to have quite a bit of interest, fascination, if you will, about what is going on underneath to explain why people do what they do. We heavily rely on very immediate impressions, as well as our, in part, culturally driven internal, quote-unquote, theories of the nature of people. As you grow up, you acquire information that helps you explain why people do what they do from your culture, from the people who surround you. You also, just through your experiences with people as you're growing up, you start to catalog a set of expectations and a set of correlations that you see between certain personality attributes and certain kinds of behaviors. You have things that you like, things that you don't like, and so on. What that does, it tends to produce for you some schematic constructs that function basically as your own implicit personality theory for making sense of other people's behavior. Now, most of the time, we feel like we're doing this job really, really well. And we hope that it leads us to fairly accurate conclusions about why people do what they do. But the fact of the matter is, we normally make these impressions, especially when we're dealing with strangers, very quickly without the benefit of much information to test whether or not we're right. And that is when we fall into the most that's when we become the most likely to make mistakes. So the first learning objective in this chapter is to explain how people use one kind of information, and that is nonverbal information, to make sense of other people in terms of how they're feeling and why they're doing what they're doing. Nonverbal behavior, I'll pause to say that this is one of those cross-disciplinary areas of research. You have research coming from the communication side of things, as well as from the psychological side. And then you have to add some little bits from sociology and anthropology as well. Nonverbal behavior refers to the way we use things like facial features, tone of voice, gesturing, using gazing and touch to communicate emotion, to communicate attitudes, to communicate interest without any words. And human beings tend to be fairly adept when sometimes there are some brain injuries that can cause a deficit in this particular area. And for some people on the autism spectrum, this is a difficult area for them as well, decoding nonverbal expressions, particularly of the face. But for most people, we become pretty adept fairly quickly at making judgments about facial features, or facial expressions and what they mean. And then over the course of our cultural experience, we learn a lot more about other aspects of nonverbal expression. Now, just for fun, here's a little video about nonverbal cues.
I'm pregnant. And you're the father, by the way? You got...
No, I could get him to forgive us. I don't know. I'm telling you. I can do it. Yeah, you can do it. It's like you're always stuck in second gear.
He was like this crazy-eyed, hairy beast man. He was like a Bigfoot or a Yeti or something. Hi, just so you know, we didn't mean to fog you. We actually thought you were like a Yeti or something. Hi.
So you like the short hair better?
What? Yeti? Danny?
Babe? Hello? You two are happy, then I'm happy for you. I'm fine. Really? Absolutely. I'm fine. Totally fine. I don't know why it's coming out all loud and squeaky, because really, I'm fine. Joe? Well, I guess Joey went home. Oh, and look, there is still one box that I have to unpack. Gotcha! Oh my God, you almost gave me a heart attack. Oh. My best friend and my sister, I cannot believe this.
Sorry, but it's true. I love him too.
My best friend and my sister. I cannot believe this. Things are going great. Let's put aside the fact that you accidentally picked up my grandmother's ring and you accidentally proposed to Rachel. When people do this, I don't really know what that means. I'm sorry.
So what that video does, by using short clips from the TV series Friends, is to show the degree to which the nonverbal elements of our communications are critically important to helping us derive meaning from our interactions. The absence of those nonverbals can often cause problems. We use a lot of nonverbal cues to help us express emotions, even when those emotions are complex, and even when those emotions are contrary to our behavior at the moment. We also use nonverbal cues to communicate what we like and what we dislike, as well as sharing information about our personalities. We use a lot of this information when we're trying to express emotion on the face. And you were given lots of examples of this in the Friends videos of moving the eyebrows, changing the way that we're shaping the mouth, changing the shape of the eyes, such as opening the eyes wide, slitting them closely shut. But there's also that sort of paralinguistic cueing that involves changes in vocal inflection and so on that communicate a lot about our emotional state. In terms of communicating attitudes, we use all kinds of ways of communicating that. Sometimes it's gestural. If you don't really like something, you may use a negative gesture with the hands, or you may shrug shoulders, or you may cross your arms. On the face, we can communicate negativity with facial expressions that denote disgust, for example, or even anger when we dislike something. On the flip side of that, if we are happy, we use smiles, open eyes, and so on. We might even lean forward or move forward in order to indicate those feelings. And then sharing information about our personality often comes through in the combination of all the other types of nonverbal information. You know, if you are seeing somebody even across a room and they are have a very open face, lots of wide open eyes, lots of smiling, lots of talking, an open stance, maybe even a bubbliness that you can perceive, you may infer that this is a very outgoing, extroverted, cheerful person. If, on the other hand, you're at a party and you see someone standing off to the side, being by themselves, perhaps looking down, frowning, or looking simply neutral, you may infer that they are not outgoing, and in addition to just not having a good time. Now let's look a little deeper into facial expressions of emotion.
We can tell how other people are feeling just by looking at them. When someone is happy, they smile. When they are sad, they frown. But where do these facial expressions come from? Are they learned or are they innate? David Matsumoto studied these questions for years in his Culture and Emotion Research Lab at San Francisco State.
Facial expressions are so important because they are part of a nonverbal communication system that we all have and we use extensively when we communicate with others. Facial expressions comment on the words in many different ways so that you know that a person may be joking or they may be very serious. I think this is why we have emoticons in email. Facial expressions are very difficult to study in the lab because when people are in the lab, they're watching what they're doing. And so oftentimes what you get in the laboratory is not what occurs in real life.
David realized there was a better setting to study expressions, the 2004 Summer Olympic Games. It just so happened he was headed there anyway, as a researcher for the International Judo Federation.
And the Olympics is the perfect place to do one of these studies because it's real life, it's naturalistic, it's very emotional.
He then turned his eye and the camera toward the Paralympic Games.
By studying the expressions of the blind athletes in the Paralympic Games, and then comparing them to the expressions of the athletes in the sighted, the regular Olympic Games, we can tell whether they have the same expressions or not.
And the result?
Those who won showed signs of true enjoyment, Those who lost showed sadness, distress, fear, or anger. And they were the exact same facial muscle movements that occurred in both the sighted and the blind. They occurred at both exactly the same times in exactly the same ways. And they differentiated winners and losers in exactly the same ways. And so the findings were amazingly similar. So the study of the blind athletes in the Paralympic Games showed us conclusively that the source of facial expressions of emotions must be resident in some innate biological program that we all have, that we're born with, and that we have from birth. And that everybody all around the world, as long as you're a human, has that. And I think that that's a very powerful message that this study shows.
So the next time you see someone smile or frown, remember, you are seeing an expression of their DNA.
Essentially, what Matsumoto's research shows is that there are elements of our use of our physical facial features that have evolved over millennia of time to help us communicate without words. It's unclear which came first, words or facial expressions, but the assumption is that facial expressions came first and the more complex experience of language a bit later. Regardless, we need these facial expressions, this critical set of 6 major emotions. Each of these is tied to our ability to survive. So, for instance, disgust, which is featured down here, if you show disgust and say a baby or a little kid sees you show disgust, what that communicates is the thing is to be avoided because it could make you sick. It's gross enough that it could be bad for you. For surprise, which is shown here, that could suggest that, especially if it's mixed with fear, surprise and fear tend to be conflated. If those two appear, it suggests to others something to be concerned about because it's not normally in the environment, and in fact it could be a threat. Now for anger, same idea. If you're angry, it's because someone has violated the codes that are designed to keep your social relationships running smoothly. And if they've broken those rules, an angry reaction may be the response. Or it could be tied to, according to evolutionary theory, it could be tied to mating. You know, if two of the species are fighting for another in order for the ability to mate with that other target individual, they may become angry with each other because they are a threat to each other's ability to reproduce. Anger can also come into play when people are competing for scarce resources. So they maybe get angry with each other, and that can then, trigger aggressive responses. The idea of sadness is something that some have speculated evolved so that it would sort of create the context for empathetic connections and meaningful connections to others. So keeping close relations close so that they know when you're hurting, when you're in trouble, and you need to be taken care of. And this is especially important in kinship networks where you have a genetic bias in the direction of helping individuals who are genetically connected to you. Sadness can signal that there's something problematic, and if you want your genes to survive, you're going to, connect to that person. Now, facial emotions aren't strictly, to be interpreted in terms of evolutionary theory. Every one of these 6 major emotions is incredibly useful and informative. We don't always say what we're feeling, but our faces do tend to communicate emotions, sometimes whether we like it or not. So what do we do with nonverbal information? Basically, we have to encode the information where we're expressing nonverbals. Maybe you're giving somebody a smile or a flirt, and suggesting that you'd like to talk more. There are things you do with your face, with your body, with your vocal tone to indicate those things. Or maybe you want somebody to leave you alone. So you can adopt facial expressions of partial neutrality and disgust, and that should send them a signal that you want nothing to do with them, and they'll leave. So that's encoding. So you're encoding information that shows other people how you're feeling. Decoding is when you're interpreting the nonverbal behaviors of others when they express it. So, sporting events are great for this. You can kind of tell, even if you don't know what, say somebody is at a sporting event and they're not wearing team colors. By decoding their nonverbal behavior, you can probably make a pretty good guess about which team they favor. So if their team is losing, they will appear to be more sad and deflated. If their team is winning, they may be smiling and jumping up and down and exuding all sorts of happiness. So facial expressions, if you look at Matsumoto's research and sort of the discussion I just had about, what's the purpose of having those 6 basic emotions, and there are many more facial expressions as well, but certain of them are argued to be universal, meaning regardless of cultural context and regardless of whether people can hear or not hear, see or not see, these emotions tend to be interpreted, so encoded and decoded in the same way. So that's anger, happiness, surprise, fear, disgust, and sadness. And these are also the emotional expressions on the face that tend to show up first in babies as well, because they have clear social purposes. If you have a baby that is showing happiness in the form of a smile, the adults around that baby tend to respond very positively. They tend to want to engage. They tend to want to talk more. Other kinds of expressions of sadness and upset in infants are, a direct call for attention. I'm cold, or I'm wet, or I'm dirty, or I'm hungry, or I just need to burp, or I'm feeling kind of lost and lonely. Whatever it is, it communicates without words what that baby might need. So another universal is that all humans encode and express these basic emotions in the same basic way. Despite whatever facial features differ around the world, we all tend to use our faces to communicate these 6 emotions. Other emotions are not the same. So more complex emotions that require more of that higher order processing are things like guilt, shame, embarrassment, and pride. And those are much more culturally dependent. Some cultures, have very clear use of facial expressions like guilt and shame or embarrassment. Some even have, pride is not seen as an appropriate expression of public emotion in some cultures, so you're going to close that down. Now, Matsumoto was only looking at comparing people who can see versus people who are visually impaired. And another, line of research could say, cross-culturally, what happens when people are winning? What's been found I think I'd have to fact check this to make sure. I can't remember if it was like a big national conference or whether it was an Olympic Games, but they did a study looking at people on the award stands. And what they found was that those individuals who were winning from Western cultures tended to show lots of overt expressions of pride, whereas individuals from Eastern cultures, particularly Asia, tended to show much less because it's perceived to be being prideful is seen as too individualistic in some contexts. One thing that makes it very difficult for us to make sense of some facial features or facial expressions of emotion is something called affect blends. And here's an example from The Office. What you have here is a mixture of authentic and inauthentic emotions. So if you just look at his mouth, it appears to be a smile. But if you track up to the upper lip and the nose, you have a hint of anger and perhaps even disgust. The eyes have a sort of squint that clearly communicates anger. If you add the fist, then you've got a mixture of, yeah, I'm supposed to be smiling and happy right now. I'm not. I'm really angry. And that's a classic example of an affect blend, where you're mixing two or more different emotions at the same time to communicate something complex, which can, come in the form of things like sarcasm, and other sorts of humor. But also, if you're in a situation where it's simply not safe for you to be overtly angry and hostile, you may hide your feelings in an affect blend so that, say, if you're talking to your boss doesn't get offended, but your teammates, the people around you, they know that you're not happy. Another aspect of nonverbal communication is something called display rules. And display rules are highly culturally dependent, and they determine, in what kind of context are you supposed to show what kind of emotional expressions. So every culture has, and every subculture has, rules about how to behave. When I was in college, I attended a funeral for a person who was Jewish. And I had not been to an Orthodox Jewish funeral rite in the past. So this was a new experience for me, having been raised, I was raised Methodist, very, very straight up Protestant. And in my family's faith tradition, funerals were very somber. There was emotional expression, but it was somber and respectful and relatively quiet. When I went to this particular service, and I will granted it was for a young girl who had passed tragically in an accident, but there was far more very intense, very public expression of deep, deep sorrow. There was more wailing, there was more touching, there was more holding, and even holding up of other people. And that's an example of some differences in display rules. American cultural norms, for example, if you're talking about pretty somewhat overgeneralized, but there is a tendency to discourage lots of displays of grief and crying among males and people who present as male, and more permission to exhibit grief and crying among women. At the same time, for females in American culture, we're often heavily criticized for women and people who present as feminine. We're often criticized for showing anger and hostility, even when the situation demands it. So men, on the other hand, tend to be rewarded for such expressions because it's consistent with their gender roles. So we tend to associate emotional experiences like sadness as being more feminine, whereas we tend to assume that anger is more masculine and therefore more fitting for expression by males. There are also cross-cultural differences. Some studies have shown that in some Eastern cultures, for example, there's research looking at Japanese norms for emotional expressions. There's some tendency to encourage people to learn to mask their negative facial expressions and to smile instead or to laugh instead. And just generally speaking, to have more neutrality in facial expressions, or just a general kind of generic positive expression. In the Western world, so Western Europe, the US, Canada, there's a tendency to assume that your facial expressions are a direct expression of who you are. And in the Western world, you're not supposed to hide that. You're not supposed to lie about that. And so hiding your facial expressions is assumed to be in some ways disingenuous. The opposite appears to be the case in terms of display rules in some Eastern cultures, where it's expected that you put on a fairly plain, neutral to positive expression when you're out in the world, especially if you're dealing with strangers. It's in some cases argued to be impolite or too individualistic, too selfish when you run around expressing all of your emotions all the time. Your emotional expressions are for privacy. They're to be done within the close confines of your more close relationships. Another kind of nonverbal communication tool that we use all the time are something called emblems. And these are nonverbal gestures. Now, we have all kinds of them, and they're highly culturally specific. They're highly generational in nature. So if you think of things as simple as the OK sign, or using air quotes like we saw in the Friends video, there are all kinds of emblems like that. Be aware, however, that these are not in any way universal. One emblem in one culture, like the OK sign, that we use so often in the United States, may be interpreted as highly offensive in other cultural contexts, or the V for victory sign may be interpreted as highly offensive in some cultural contexts. So these emblems, hand signals are often what they involve, are highly individualistic. So during the it was probably started in 2024 when there were some early signs that there were going to be some issues between Canada and the United States. And then that amplified in early 2025 after the inauguration. Some of my Canadian friends and family started sending me elbows up memes, and that's an emblem in Canadian culture which means, I don't know whether it comes from hockey or what, you'll have to tell me, but elbows up means we're ready for a fight. Bring it. We're ready to elbow your teeth back into the back of your skull, basically. So another classic example of an emblem. Elbows up in American culture means absolutely nothing, but for Canadians, very significant. Now that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 4.1. Next time, we'll be covering 4.2, which involves understanding how we make sense of first impressions.